On January 2nd, 2015, popular and highly controversial UFO researcher Linda Moulton Howe received a shocking email from a retired U.S. Navy officer. Being a respected name in the field, such emails weren't anything out of the ordinary for Linda. However, as she clicked on the email and started to read, she immediately realized that this was an email unlike anything she had ever received. The sender was a retired U.S. Navy Petty Officer First Class Flight Engineer. He didn't give his full name, asking only to be referred to as Brian S. But as proof of his claims, Brian sent over copies of his credentials. In this email, Brian recounted a most bizarre account of high strangeness that went on in Antarctica between 1983 and 1997 when he worked with the Navy. Particularly, Brian mentioned seeing flying aerial discs darting around over the Transantarctic Mountains. He also recounted seeing a research base beneath the ice, staffed by both human and extraterrestrial beings. This revelation, coming from someone who witnessed it all, was amazing. So, naturally, Linda Moulton Howe arranged an interview with him that revealed even more shocking secrets and has now been watched by millions.
Well, my impression was that they weren't human. I said, human? I said, what are you talking about? He says, it seemed to me they were talking about like an extraterrestrial or an alien, because they didn't refer to them as a person, it was a visitor.
It's not the first time these Antarctica UFO-based rumors are making the rounds, and loads of efforts have been made in the past to debunk them. However, the Brian S. files seem to be resurrecting them once again. If you're familiar with names like the Thu Society or Vril, you probably have that knowing smile on your face. It appears the long-fabled prophecy is coming true. If you're not familiar with either of those names, however, then buckle down, because I'm about to take you down one of the most complex labyrinths in UFO history. Perhaps the best place to begin this video is by going through the email sent by Brian S. to Linda Moulton Howe. So, first off, here's what we know about Brian S. according to the email he sent. The opening of his email reads, "Hi Linda, I'm a retired U.S. Navy LC-130 flight engineer that retired after 20 years of service in 1997. I've been wanting to write you for a long time about my experience on the Antarctic continent with flying vehicles that I was told not to talk about. I served part of my 20 years in the Navy with a squadron called Antarctic Development Squadron 6, or VXE-6 as it was also known. I served with this squadron from around 1983 till I retired March of 1997. Alright, so before I go on, I can confirm that the Antarctic Development Squadron 6, or VXE-6, is real. According to Military Wiki, the squadron was established on January 1st, 1969, to help provide aviation support for Operation Deep Freeze, which was the operations arm of the United States Antarctic Program. So that part of Brian's story checks out. Another part of Brian's story that seemingly checks out is his identity. Emphasis on the word seemingly. Brian S. appears to be who he claimed to be, as he sent a couple of credentials to Linda as part of his email. For instance, there's this photo of him holding a US flag at the South Pole. Brian also sent along a copy of an Antarctic Service Medal that was awarded to him on November 20th, 1984. So, as I said earlier, the identity part also appears to check out. Now, let's talk about the weird stuff Brian S. went on to talk about in his email, and I'd like you to hear him yourself. I'll just skip to the parts that most affect us, but if you want to read the entire email, I'll drop a link in the description for you to check out. On several flights to and from South Pole Station, our crew viewed air vehicles darting around the tops of Transantarctics, almost exactly in the same spot every time we would fly by and view them. This is very unusual for air traffic down there, due to the fact that the only aircraft flying on the continent were on squadron aircraft. Every aircraft knew where the other aircraft were, due to flight schedules being followed. In other words, Brian and his crew encountered not one or two, but numerous UFOs flying over the Transantarctic Mountain range. In his interview with Linda, Brian would go on to describe the UFOs as being silvery and round in shape, with a shiny reflection. Brian also mentioned that the shiny objects had sporadic movements, and seemed to restrict their darting around to the Transantarctic Mountain range, never inching close to the Beardmore Glacier, which was quite close by. But that's not all. Brian also talked about how he and his crew somehow got to witness something that they were never meant to see, according to the intelligence officer who debriefed them later. Another unique issue with the South Pole Station is that our aircraft were not allowed to fly over a certain area designated 5 miles from the station. The reason stated was because of an air sampling camp in that area. This did not make any sense to any of us on the crew, because on 2 different occasions we had to fly over this area, one time being due to a medical evacuation of the Australian camp called Davis Camp. It was on the opposite side of the continent, and we had to refuel at the South Pole, and a direct course to this Davis camp was right over the air sampling station. The only thing we saw going over this camp was a very large hole going into the ice. You could fly one of our LC-130 into this thing. For perspective, this is an LC-130. As you can see, it's anything but a small plane, so a hole that can swallow a plane as huge as this is practically an abyss at that point. And even though Brian and his crew didn't see anything besides this cavernous hole, it's obvious there was something off. Secondly, Brian S. mentions in his email that after the mission, he and his crew were briefed by a man from Washington, D.C. he assumed to be an intelligence agent. The man basically told them, "Okay, you guys saw this thing," referring to the hole in the ice that Brian and his crew had observed during their flight, "but you did not see it." He then warned Brian and his crew never to speak of what they had seen within that area. Of course, if you're a regular on this channel, you already know that this is a common trope in UFO encounters. The man in black always shows up. So it's not surprising that Brian and his crew have this experience. By the way, Brian would later find out what exactly went down in that large hole in the ice. But before I get to that, let's discuss the third major point Brian described in his email and his interview with Linda. And this is probably the bombshell part of the Brian S. files. Alright, so for context, within the timeline that Brian S. reports about, there was this mission that was on, and a team of scientists and researchers were camped near Mary Bird Land for that mission. Now, this camp in question was literally in the middle of nowhere, and it was Brian and his crew who were tasked with the job of dropping off the scientists and their gear at this base. Because of the remoteness of the camp, and for the scientists' safety, the plan was that the scientists, 15 of them, would radio McMurdo Station regularly to let them know that everything was still going okay. For the first couple of weeks, everything went according to plan. However, after a while, it appeared that the scientists suddenly fell off the radar, as no one heard from them for a stretch of about 2 weeks. When this happened, Brian and his crew were sent back to the base to find out what was going on. Strangely, when Brian got there, there was no one around, even though all of their gear was still there. Then, a week later, McMurdo Station receives a radio comm. It's the missing scientists, and they request to be picked up without any more explanation given. Immediately, Brian and his crew make their way down to the scientists to pick them up. But from the look on these people's faces, it's clear that they have been traumatized in some way. Most of them look scared, and a couple of them just have these blank stares. None of them would eat or drink anything either. Now it gets stranger. When they get to McMurdo, the scientists are moved to their chalet in a separate vehicle. That's not the weird part. The weird part is that their gear was immediately put in a separate building where no one was permitted to enter. And then, after that, the gear was put into another airplane all by itself. No other cargo or person allowed. And then it was flown to Christchurch in New Zealand. No one saw or heard from the scientists or their gear after that. Once again, how do we explain this high strangeness? Well, Brian S. mentioned in his interview with Linda that there were rumors that the scientists had somehow stumbled on or were even probably made to participate in a joint venture between humans and extraterrestrials that was going on around the South Pole Station at the time. Brian also mentions that he and his crew had overheard some of the scientists at the South Pole Station talking about a UFO base at the air sampling site. That is the site where the crew had seen the large hole in the ice earlier. Apparently, at this UFO base, extraterrestrial beings were working together with human scientists. Putting two and two together, it seems to be that this was where the stunned scientists were abducted. But who knows, right? Be that as it may, I do have one nagging issue at the back of my mind, and you're probably wondering the same too. Why does it seem like some of the more substantive things Brian mentions in his email and interview with Linda Moulton Howe were mostly hearsay? Sure, he did see the giant hole in the ice and the flying discs. However, he didn't see the thing about humans and extraterrestrials working together. What he knows about these things was just speculation and hearsay. He never even saw the so-called air sampling research facility itself, just the hole in the ice. So it's kind of tricky. Should we believe him? Should we not? On one hand, it could be that this is proof that Brian S. isn't embellishing his story. He's simply telling it as it is. On the other hand, maybe he's just making stuff up and putting the more substantive claims in other people's mouths because he has no way of proving it. This was what played in the back of my mind as I tried to research various aspects of Brian's story. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that Brian himself had no clue just how convoluted the rabbit hole he was in really was. What Brian experienced in Antarctica with the flying aerial discs and the human/ET collaboration is not mere speculation. We have a wealth of documented evidence that shows that the reports coming out from Antarctica through whistleblowers like Brian are actually the progression of an affair that started taking root long before now. I'm talking as far back as after World War I. Now, I want you to pay close attention, because there's a whole lot to unpack. There's no discussing the Antarctic and extraterrestrial activity without talking about the Thu Society. The Thu Society was a German secret society founded in 1918 after the end of World War I. It was this group that backed and funded the Hitler-led Nazi Party's rise to power, which probably tells you everything you need to know about their beliefs. But here's the part of the story. There was a reason for that. There was a reason Thu got its hands into German politics. You see, the Thu Society needed access to the very best minds Germany had to offer, because they had this secret project they were working on, and I'm talking about a space program, which also involves extraterrestrials. The Thu Society considered all pure-blooded Germans to be descendants of a certain ancient civilization known as the Hyperboreans, believed to have existed thousands of years ago before they went underground to continue as a subterranean race. To be clear, the legends around Hyperborea are much more complex than this, but for the sake of this video, that's all we need to know. Let me know if you'd like me to do a deep dive into Hyperborea in a separate video though. Alright, back to the legends. So, it is believed that the Hyperboreans will one day re-emerge from their subterranean hiding place, after which they will dominate the world and wipe out all inferior races. To be fair, I've only heard this version of the Hyperborean myth from the Thu Society, so take that story with a pinch of salt. Anyway, since the Thu Society believed that the Hyperboreans were their progenitors, they consequently believed that it was on them to harness the hidden technologies of this civilization and then develop them to usher in the re-emergence of the Hyperboreans. Enter Maria Orsic. Orsic was a psychic, and in 1919, she had a strange experience where she telepathically received some messages from some otherworldly beings. Using automatic writing, Orsic quickly wrote down this telepathic message on paper. However, the language in which she wrote was completely foreign to her, so she had no idea what she even wrote about until she got in contact with the Thu Society. When the Thu Society read Orsic's papers, they discovered that she had actually written in ancient Sumerian, and the message she had telepathically received was actually design plans for building a spaceship. As you'd expect, the Thu Society was pretty excited to see this, and so, without much deliberation, they quickly started making plans on how Orsic's design could be prototyped, effectively marking the birth of a top-secret German spacecraft development program. By 1939, just before the start of World War II, the Thu Society decided they needed more privacy, so they made the move to relocate. Can you guess where they chose? Of course you're right, Antarctica. The group believed that the remoteness of the area would give them everything they needed to carry on their program without any possible disruption, which was why they chose it. Unfortunately for them, however, the United States got wind of their plans and sent spies into Antarctica long before Brian S. even got on the scene. What they found was pretty disturbing, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the next part of this conversation. To begin with, I have to kinda go back on something I said earlier. To say that the United States got wind of Germany's spacecraft development plans is a little misleading. America didn't hear of the plans as much as they actively funded and supported them. So, in 1941, while World War II was still raging, the US had initially sanctioned Germany from trade relations. However, 6 days after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt did something really strange. Rather than enforce the ban even more, the president issued Executive Order 8389. Executive Order 8389 basically allowed American companies to bypass the Trading with the Enemy Act and resume trading with Germany, which was really strange considering Germany and Japan were allies, and this was the middle of World War II, right after Pearl Harbor was attacked for that matter. But according to certain sources, FDR did this for two reasons. First, he did it to protect the interests of certain corporate elite, many of whom were sympathetic to Hitler and his ideals. Secondly, to create an opportunity to infiltrate key German companies and gather intelligence, something that would have been very valuable during the war. And speaking of gathering intelligence, this leads us to two valuable eyewitnesses with testimonies that corroborate Brian's account, William Mills Tommpkins and Admiral Richard Byrd. Let's begin with William Mills Tommpkins. In 2015, an ex-Navy man by the name of William Mills Tommpkins released a book, Selected by Extraterrestrials. Now, before I go into the damning details revealed in this book, a lot of which implicate many top federal government officials, just a bit of backstory on Tommpkins. Tommpkins was an exceptional kid with an exceptional mind. From the age of 9, he would tour Navy ships at the Long Beach harbor, and then go on to build models with such level of detail and accuracy that the Navy was almost convinced that his father was a spy. Ultimately, the Navy would find out that this was not the case, and when that happened, Tommpkins was immediately withdrawn from high school to join the Navy in the intelligence department. The rest, they say, is history. Fast forward to 2015, and Tommpkins releases his book, disclosing some pretty damning information about a U.S. Navy classified espionage mission to Germany's aerospace industry between 1942 and 1946. The mission yielded very interesting information, which I will now summarize for the sake of time. First, the mission revealed that Germany had secretly developed up to 30 prototype spacecraft using anti-gravity and other exotic propulsion systems. If you remember correctly, this was the Thu Society's top mission after receiving the telepathic designs from Maria Orsic. Secondly, Tommpkins noted that many of these spacecraft prototypes were actually extraterrestrial in origin, and that the most technologically advanced ones were developed within hidden bases in Antarctica. Once again, this tracks with what we know about the Thu Society. They had relocated their base to Antarctica because they wanted a spacious and remote place where they could prototype their spacecraft without interruptions. Number 3. Tommpkins revealed that Germany was secretly helped by 2 different groups of extraterrestrials to achieve significant technological breakthroughs in their aerospace program. 4. Tommpkins also revealed that top German and U.S. companies provided funding for the development of these special anti-gravity spacecraft, particularly leveraging the growing U.S. military-industrial complex at the time. In fact, Tommpkins mentions the names of top American corporate elite who were involved in funding the project, including Alan Dulles, who later became CIA director, John Foster Dulles, who later became Secretary of State, the Rockefeller brothers, and Prescott Bush, who later became a U.S. Senator and both father and grandfather to 2 U.S. presidents. Now, let's backtrack a bit. When you compare Brian's story with all of these different stories we're getting from different sources, all of whom don't even know each other, the testimony is pretty consistent. In fact, these other stories seem to be filling in the gaps in Brian's testimony. Brian S. mentioned seeing flying aerial discs darting across the mountains, but what he probably saw, according to these other sources, was the testing of the Thu Society's spacecraft prototypes, which Tommpkins also testified to seeing during the 1940s when he was stationed in Antarctica. Brian S. also mentioned seeing a hole in the ice that was large enough for an LC-130 to fly into. The official story was that the area was an air sampling facility. However, Brian would later hear rumors that the scientists in the so-called air sampling facility were actually working with aliens. Again, this tracks with the revelations about the Thu Society, as well as Tommpkins' eyewitness testimony, which means that Brian's testimony to Linda Moulton Howe was likely true. But we still have one other major eyewitness testimony to look into, Admiral Byrd. And this testimony changes everything. In 1946, the United States Navy launched a mission to Antarctica known as Operation High Jump. The purpose of this mission was to map and explore suitable sites on the continent where the United States could set up a base, or at least that's what the public was told. The classified purpose of this mission, however, was more militaristic than scientific. The mission had actually been set up to destroy all German bases in Antarctica. I mean, the group that went to Antarctica for Operation High Jump included 4,700 men, 70 ships, and 33 aircraft. No scientific expedition in the history of scientific expeditions ever needed that much firepower. But then, oddly, even with the armada that the US went to Antarctica with, this mission, that was supposed to last up to 6 months, ended in a mere 8 weeks. Because, according to a report in a Chilean newspaper, the expedition ran into trouble and suffered many fatalities. Specifically, many of Byrd's men were lost, and at least 4 of his aircraft disappeared after coming in contact with strange enemy aircraft that no one was able to trace. Judging from Byrd's own words, it seems he believed that the US Navy team encountered otherworldly aerial craft deployed by the hostile German forces. In fact, Byrd's comment after Operation High Jump's abrupt cancellation is very telling. He said, "I do not want to scare anybody, but the bitter reality is that in the event of a new war, the United States will be attacked by aircraft flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds." Aircraft that flies from the North Pole to the South Pole at incredible speeds? I don't know about you, but that sounds like a UFO to me. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about the sneaky side of Operation High Jump that no one ever talks about. But this isn't the place for that. I did a video about that already, so if you want to learn more about it, feel free to check it out. One thing that intrigued me about this story was that this was a story that transcended time, government, and policies. Individually, it made no sense at all, and there was room for a lot of questions and criticism. But as a whole, it all fits well together, like a jigsaw puzzle. From the Thu Society to Tommpkins to Byrd, and now to Brian, it's all related and connected. And mind you, all 3 men lived in different times and never met each other, and yet their stories were connected. If that's a coincidence, then that's a mighty big chunk of it. Now, up to this point, we've seen testimonies from different sources filling in the gaps in Brian's story, but as you know, I always like to look at the other side of every topic to make sure I'm being as fair as possible. So let's quickly move on to the other side of this conversation and talk about the more questionable aspects of Brian's testimony and all the theories that have followed. Not surprisingly, my first red flag in all of this was Linda Moulton Howe herself. I recently did a deep dive into Linda Moulton Howe, and what I found wasn't pretty. Not to completely tarnish her image, I will admit in the first place that back in the day, Linda was a highly respected UFO researcher with a very high credibility. However, recently, her so-called whistleblowing has been little more than poorly researched hoaxes and interviews with less than credible witnesses whose backgrounds she never bothers to verify. So yes, Linda being the one to break this story to us leaves me a bit doubtful. I mean, that's like trusting the words coming out from any politician in your country. I also have an issue with Brian. I mean, yes, he shared his photos and other credentials with Linda, and I shared the ones that Linda shared with the public on her website. Nevertheless, there's no way to confirm anything. Those credentials could belong to anyone. Those photos could belong to anyone. Plus, Brian S. does not provide much by way of concrete evidence for the things he claims to have experienced, so we're forced to take his word for it, which is difficult because we don't know who he is, which means there's no way to prove 100% that he is credible. But I will give him the benefit of the doubt by saying maybe he doesn't want the limelight. not everyone wants to sell copies of books and become UFO celebrities. Some just want to tell their story. Not a story, not what they think, but just their story and what they witnessed. So I want to believe that could be the case for Brian. I mean, I know someone who does amazing, generous things for people anonymously. Said person doesn't want your thanks or your praise. It's all done anonymously, so I get people not wanting the fame or recognition. Still, if I'm being totally honest, I do not think that even the shaky credibility of both Linda and Brian S. totally disproves the stories coming out of Antarctica. As much as Brian S. does not provide concrete evidence for his claims, the fact that his story tracks with stories coming from multiple whistleblowers from different places should give us reason to at least look into his claims critically. Besides, even a broken clock is right at least twice a day, right? So there might still be a modicum of truth to what Brian reveals in his email and interview with Linda. The question will now be, how much truth? And for the sake of this argument, and to be as fair as possible to both skeptics and believers, I'm going to assume that Linda and Brian S. were being sincere. But even starting with that viewpoint, I still ended up with several head-scratching moments as I looked more critically into some of the surrounding claims concerning German spacecraft and Antarctica. So here is a comprehensive, peer-reviewed report done by respected marine biologist and oceanographer at Cambridge, Colin Summerhays. I'll link to it in the description if you want to read it yourself. Summerhays' main point seems to be that while there is a bit of truth in all of the wild reports coming out of Antarctica, a lot has actually been sensationalized. Take the bird comment, for example, where he is quoted as saying that the Germans had aerial craft that could move from pole to pole at incredible speeds. That turned out to be a mistranslation. The quote was first reported in a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, after an interview granted by Bird to American reporter Lee Van Atta. Here's the correct translation and a fuller context of what the newspaper reported. Admiral Richard E. Byrd warned today that the United States should adopt measures of protections against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. The Admiral explained that he was not trying to scare anyone, but the cruel reality is that, in case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. The fantastic speed with which the world is shrinking, recalled the Admiral, is one of the most important lessons learned during his recent Antarctic exploration. I have to warn my compatriots that the time has ended when we were able to take refuge in our isolation and rely on the certainty that the distances, the oceans, and the poles were a guarantee of safety. But this wasn't the only misleading part about Bird's mission. Contrary to what UFO researchers reported, there was nothing classified about the militaristic purpose of Bird's mission. Quite on the contrary, it was a well-known fact. It just wasn't for the purpose of destroying any German bases on Antarctica, mostly because there was no such thing. I'll get to the true purpose of the US Navy's 1946 expedition to Antarctica later, but for now, let's talk about how the rumors of a secret Nazi UFO base in Antarctica started in the first place. First of all, yes, Germany did go to Antarctica. A few months before World War II started, Germany commissioned a small expedition to Antarctica to establish a base, not for aerial craft development, but for their whaling fleet. At the time, Norway and Britain were making claims to significant portions of the Antarctic, and Germany was scared that if they didn't establish their own whaling base fast, they would get cut out. It had happened to them before with the British on the South Atlantic, and Germany didn't want that happening again, not with the huge investment they had made in the industry. The mission was supposed to happen in a series of phases. The first phase, which involved mapping the region, happened successfully in 1938/1939. The next phase, which should have involved the construction of the bases, turned out to be a failure, thanks to the outbreak of war. In other words, there was no secret Nazi base in Antarctica. The Germans ended up making only one trip to the Antarctic until 1959, when they undertook a joint expedition with Russia. Summerhays mentions in this report that he was unable to locate any German document indicating that German activity continued in Antarctica after the 1938/1939 expedition. Plus, interviews with many captured Nazis after the war offered irrefutable evidence disproving the prevalent rumors about the existence of a Nazi UFO base in Antarctica. But let's even say that the Germans lied about their mission and actually covertly built a base during their mapping mission. Even that claim is still problematic due to the harsh terrain in Antarctica. For perspective, in 1911, when Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen wanted to build a tiny hut in the Antarctic, Amundsen had to use about 80 dogs, and even at that, it still took his team a total of 14 days to build one hut. Now, compare this with the German mapping expedition. The team was only there for a month, and there was no record of the team traveling with any motorized equipment or any dogs, which is to be expected since it was a mapping mission. If the Germans did build a massive underground complex under the ice in Antarctica in 1 month without any motorized equipment or any dog, then they really did pull off a miracle, because it's not just a Herculean task, it's practically impossible. So if there was no Nazi UFO base in Antarctica, why did the US Navy launch a military expedition to Antarctica? Well, with the possibility of war with the Soviets hanging in the air, the US Navy wanted to train its men to operate in freezing polar conditions. That was why the expedition involved that many men with that many ships and planes. By the way, the thing about President Roosevelt allowing American companies to fund the German space program by allowing them to circumvent the Trading with the Enemy Act turns out to be false as well. Yes, Roosevelt did issue Executive Order 8389, but it had nothing to do with allowing trade relations between American companies and German companies. Quite the opposite. The order further strangulated Germany's access to funding for their war. This is not to say, however, that American companies did not trade with German companies during World War II, but that's not the point of today's conversation. Ultimately, the point is, there was no German UFO base in Antarctica, nor was there any militaristic mission by the US to destroy any German base in Antarctica. At least there's no evidence for that, not in German war records or in America war records. But does that totally debunk the claims of Brian S. and William Tommpkins? Well, there might be an indirect link, but drawing a straight line from the lack of evidence for a Nazi Antarctic base to debunking the claims of whistleblowers might not be that easy. The fact that these stories are eyewitness testimonies, not just claims from so-called researchers, makes them impossible to simply gloss over. Tommpkins was in the intelligence department of the US Navy. His stories might sound incredible, but until they are debunked outright, they still hang there. Also, even though we might not be able to prove Brian's identity without any reasonable doubt, the fact that his story has been confirmed in independent testimonies from a known high-ranking officer, William Tommpkins, should give him some credibility. Of course, there's always the disinformation angle. We know from history that the US government is a master of disinformation. We also know that Linda Moulton Howe has fallen prey to disinformation agents like Richard Doty before. Some even say she might be a disinformation agent herself. Now, if that's the case, that brings another angle to the Brian S. interview. If the whole thing was simply a disinformation stunt, then that means there's a bigger truth the government is trying to hide. I mean, it's either that, or this whole thing is just outright falsehood from start to finish. But what do you think about it? Feel free to share your thoughts, and if you think you need more information, then be sure to check out my video on the Admiral Byrd expedition. And don't forget to check the description for all the links to sources you can use for your personal research.